All right, good evening, everybody. I know we still have some people joining us, but wanted to go ahead and get things started. Thank you so much for being here for the final session of our Crucial Conversation series. My name is Annie Black, and I am the Director of Programs and Volunteers at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Just one logistical announcement before we get started tonight. We do very much encourage questions during this program. We'll leave plenty of time at the end for our speakers to address those. So if you want to go ahead and locate your Q&A button, if you are on a computer, it should be at the bottom of your screen. If you're on a tablet or other mobile device, it might be near the top. So anytime you have a question, go ahead and open that up. Go ahead and type your question in, and we will get to as many as we can. So I'd go ahead and like to turn it over to Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the museum, to get us started. Mary Pat?
Thanks so much, Annie. Good evening, everyone. As Annie said, I'm Mary Pat Higgins. I'm the President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, and I want to personally thank you for joining us for the final installment of our Crucial Conversation series on race and racism in our community. Our goal for this series has been to foster an increased understanding of racism in both a historical and contemporary context, and an awareness of concrete steps that can be taken to disrupt systemic racism. For everyone who has joined us on this journey, I hope you have found the experience valuable. We come to this conversation not as the expert on this topic, but as a convener of individuals, organizations, and community partners that have been working to advance racial equity. This series represents what we aim to do every day at the museum: learn from history, honor the power of personal testimonies, and share opportunities with a call to action. In the first 3 sessions of this series, we discussed the why behind the series. We placed race relations and systemic racism in Dallas in historical context, and we heard about the direct impact of racism through individual testimonies. Tonight, we complete the series with a look into the future and the call to action. Before we get started, I would like to thank our presenting sponsors for Crucial Conversations, Geraldine Acuna Sunshine and Gabe Sunshine, and our series sponsor, IMA Financial Group. Thank you so much for making this possible and for supporting this critical work. I'm also proud tonight to recognize our wonderful community partners for this series. Finally, I would like to thank our board of directors and museum members for their continued tremendous support. We have an incredible group of speakers with us tonight, and they will share more about their work with you in a moment. So I just want to introduce them very briefly so we can get on to the conversation. Julianna Bradley is a consultant, facilitator, and trainer. Through her work, she equips educators and community members with tools for civic change and supports white people in grappling with our persistent legacy of white supremacy. Liz Sadia Pereira is the Chief of Equity and Inclusion for the City of Dallas. In this role, Liz oversees the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability, Office of Equity, Office of Ethics and Compliance, Office of Fair Housing and Human Rights, Office of Resilience, and the Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs. Clearly, Liz never sleeps. Jonathan Feinstein serves as the State Director for the Education Trust in Texas, where he works with and supports partners statewide to advance education equity and justice for students of color and from low-income backgrounds. He has served as a trainer with the Center for Racial Justice and Education and as a committee co-chair with Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. And Jerry Hawkins, the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. He's also a co-founder of the Imagining Freedom Institute, a thought leadership group that works with organizations to build their capacity for equity and social justice work, and co-principal of Young Leaders Strong City, a program for high school students that creates teen equity summits and councils. I'd like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our panelists for participating. We're so grateful for your time tonight. And as always, a big thank you to Camila Collins, President of Collins Collaborations, for helping to guide our program tonight and her invaluable support in the planning and execution of this series. As Annie said, we encourage you to ask questions during this session using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. After the discussion, we will try to answer as many questions as we can. And I also wanted to mention that tonight's session is being recorded. So if you need to take a break and come back to the conversation, you will be able to watch that recording on our YouTube channel in a few days. And now I'd like to turn it over to Camila.
Thank you, Mary Pat. As always, it is my privilege to join you and embark on this important conversation that we are having. Before we open up to our panelists, I want to thank you, the viewers, for tuning in, watching us, joining us throughout this series. As you know, and as Mary Pat has shared with you, we were very intentional about having this conversation because we understand that it was important for us to not only just have conversation and an exchange of ideas and perspective, but it was important for us to ground this in the context of history. What does systemic racism look like in the past? What are the current lived realities? And as we will walk in and discover tonight, what is the future opportunities for us to engage and take action? It's critically important now more than ever for us to engage in this work and to understand that there is nuance into doing this, as well as there is a unique path that is for you. We can engage in many different ways. We can have passions, we can have time for reflection, we can have time for healing, we can have time for advocacy, we can have time for appreciation and affirmation, all of which are critically important. And so the reason that we created and we invited in such a diverse panel is to share with you those many different opportunities. So again, I thank you for joining us. And now we'll just move right on in. And please, again, submit your questions to us throughout. So Liz, I'd like to start with you. If you would share with us a bit about your identity and how you enter into this work. I will also share a little bit about my journey so that way people can understand. I identify as a cisgender Black woman in America. I do this work because it is important that in order to create transformational change, we have some practical strategies, but we also engage in our heart space. That is the perspective that I bring to this work. That is the passion in which I do my facilitation and my consulting. And so thank you for joining us, Liz. And if you could just share with folks a bit about your point of entry.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Camila. And I'm sort of smiling because we didn't know who she was going to tap first to go first and introduce themselves. So I guess I'm it. And I'm really honored to be with my fellow panelists this evening to share some space with all of them and with all of you who are listening in and participating perhaps via Facebook, and want to extend my gratitude and acknowledgement to Mary Pat for her leadership at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, for holding and convening these important and crucial conversations, and for the important work and the brilliant work and the space that you take up in our city, which is so welcomed and important. I wanted to say again that my name is Liz, and I am a Dallas native, and that's sort of my entry into this space. Is born and raised in Dallas, Texas. I currently serve as the Chief of Equity and Inclusion for our city at the City of Dallas, and very, I think, fortunate and blessed to be in that, serving in that capacity in my own hometown. And as was stated, I oversee several offices and the newly integrated Office of Equity and Inclusion, which combines many of the offices that were mentioned, but we're integrated to serve as sort of a force multiplier upon one another so that we can really dig in and use our equity tools, our human rights tools, our welcoming communities, immigrant affairs tools, fair housing and justice, all under one roof. And so I'm looking forward to what's to come in the new year. A little bit about my personal space. I often like to borrow from Lin-Manuel Miranda, who says that we're lucky to be alive right now. And I'm fortunate, I think, and lucky to be alive right now. My maternal grandmother, Juanita Longoria Davila, was born in the era of Jim Crow and had 1 year of education. But she shared with me that that was her best year of childhood, and learning to read, and then being discovered as being in a white school, and being told, or parents being told, that she would have to go to the Mexican school, and just made it virtually impossible because it was 10 miles down the road and no source of transportation. So fast forward to the generation next, my mother, Maria Elena Davila Cedillo, went to 11th grade and went to Dallas Crozier Tech, which is now a refurbished building in downtown Dallas, and left early to marry my dad. So my mom, realizing that, made a crucial mistake in shortcutting her education, prioritized education for myself and for my 4 brothers. And lucky me, got to go to North Dallas High School, then University of Pennsylvania, and then received my JD from SMU Dedman School of Law. So just to say that lucky to be alive born in the 70s, not in the 50s or the 15s. So I'll stop there, and I look forward to the conversation this evening.
Thank you. Who wants to go next?
I'm happy to go. Good evening, everyone. Echo everything Liz said. Thank you for inviting us to be a part of this conversation. And really thank you to everyone who's tuned in and listening. My name is Jonathan Feinstein. What I took from what Liz mentioned is just, you're going to hear me talk a lot about the power of education and the ways in which our educational experiences socialize us and have a lot to do with our identities. And that's certainly where I kind of start my story. You know, I'm a 3rd generation Ashkenazi Jew. So both my parents were born in pretty segregated communities in Queens, New York. They met in North Carolina, and I was raised in Chapel Hill, which is a university town, honestly a very diverse town. And I grew up in a place and a time where I feel like maybe I had a unique experience of growing up in very integrated classrooms, where, you know, not just my peers, but also my teachers were diverse. And they instilled in me so much and a love of learning that has stuck with me since then. But, you know, my personal story of schooling has a lot to do with, I think, why I'm on the panel tonight and the work that I do, which is that as I went through my educational experience, I saw the ways in which systemic racism was creating segregation as I grew older, right? My classes became less and less diverse. My educators became less and less diverse. And I was one of those kids that wondered why that was. As my relationships changed, my social circles maybe changed. And so that took me down a path. I remember being in high school and reading a book that was called "Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria?" It's by Beverly Daniel Tatum. And just wanting to understand the history and understand, you know, the world around me and the forces that were really shaping my life and the people in my life. And so, you know, that kind of set me on a path towards, you know, kind of engaging very actively in conversations about my identity, about my race, and about racism in America. And so that's just a brief piece, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Jerry, go ahead.
Sure. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I go by the pronouns he, him, and his. I am originally from Chicago, born on the South Side. Chicago has been known for a lot of years as one of the most segregated cities in the country. There are 77 communities, and they're ethnic and racial enclaves. And so I grew up in a very segregated experience on the South Side of Chicago. in a community called Inglewood. I moved to Dallas in 2011 after working for the Chicago Urban League for 8 years and for the Chicago Public School as an educational consultant, and was lucky to land at the Wilkinson Center, where I served as the Director of Children's Services for 3.5 years until my previous role, which was with the Dallas Foundation. I was the project director of the 0 to 5 Funders Collaborative, where I was tasked with building a community collaborative and co-designing and managing the construction of a family center called Bachman Lake Together, which is something very proud of, because Bachman Lake is the community in which I've lived in Dallas for now over 9.5 years. I now serve as the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, where our mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through narrative change, through relationship building, and through equitable policies and practices. I am also a co-founder and co-principal of Imagining Freedom Institute, where we help individuals and organizations understand historical context so they can address contemporary issues. And we have a great youth program called Young Leaders Strong City, where we create spaces where high school students can talk about their identity, talk about race, and talk about their community, and learn to organize to change it. So I'm really happy to be here with you all. I have tons of experience with talking about race because it's my career now. But I'm just happy to be with my colleagues. I know all of these people, literally all of them, very well. And so, just a blessing to see them, especially during these times. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Julianna?
Thank you. It's good to see all of you as well, and to see your face, Jerry. I've been in Dallas for about 8 years now. My name is Julianna Bradley. I identify as a white, cisgender, queer woman who is also a mother. I have a 3, almost 4-year-old, and I'm about 4 months pregnant now. So I'm hoping I can get through this whole session without using the restroom, but chances are slim, so bear with me. But I'm happy to be with you all this evening. When I think about my point of entry into this work, I feel like I could tell a million different stories that all sort of tie together. And I'm sure that's true for all of us, because race and racism is so prevalent in every moment of our daily lives. From the time we are in utero to it shapes everything about our life until the very end. And I didn't really, as a white woman, I was never asked to think about that very much growing up. I grew up in Georgia predominantly, lived in Germany for a time as well, because my stepfather was in the military. But I had a predominantly white upbringing. My mother is white, my biological father is Dominican, but he was not in my life growing up. And so my daily experiences were very white. I had predominantly white teachers, and it wasn't until I got to college and I was in a relationship with a woman who I was very much in love with. And I found that there were rights, this is in 2006, I found that there were rights that I was not afforded in that relationship that other heterosexual couples were. And so I sought out really resources and learning on how to become an activist, because I wanted to seek my own freedom and my own rights as a queer woman. Only when I showed up at a program called Young People For, who they introduced me to sort of the concepts of intersectionality and racism. And they looked at me and said, great, we can equip you as an activist to support the LGBTQ community, but you're also a white woman. And what does that mean? And how are you going to also be in solidarity with people of color in this movement? And it was the first time I had been asked that. And so I started to really dig into my own identity, my own upbringing, the things and ways that I had been socialized. Jonathan spoke to, you know, kind of looking back at my school age years, but also I had to really learn that I am the product of and continue to perpetuate our history of colonization and white supremacy in this country. And so despite the fact that I have many people of color in my life whom I love, my partner's a person of color, my children are multiracial, I had to come to understand that my proximity as a white person to people of color does not absolve me from internalizing racism from our culture, and that it's actually a lifelong journey that I am on to unlearn and to re-establish ways of being and living that are in service to the liberation of all of us and not just the identities that I hold. And so I come to this work, you know, as a parent and as somebody who seeks to support other white people. I have been training with the Center for Racial Justice and Education alongside some of my panelists here for the last 5 years, where I work with educators and community members. I'm also one of the original founders of a nonprofit in Oak Cliff called For Oak Cliff, where we aim to liberate Oak Cliff from systemic oppression. And so I provide direct support with them and providing food to the community and sort of on the ground efforts, as well as the trainings and consulting for white people that I provide through my own work in partnership with some of the folks here as well. So that really is the focus here, is like helping white folks move from a place where we are just maybe non-racist, we think we're good people, to really digging into the work of anti-racism and what it means to actively work every single day to dismantle the systems for which that we benefit that actually are promoting genocide as we speak, and really grappling with that, what it means and what we can do differently.
Thank you. I think you all touched on a couple of things that really resonated with me. One being our individual identities and how we are socialized to understand race and racism and how that varies, and also the critically important work that we each have and how it differs. So I'd like for you, and just jump in, whoever would like to talk about a bit about how your racial identity, how you began, first of all, to understand what that is, and then also how did that impact either your unlearning or your willingness to kind of disrupt white supremacy? Because in part, I know as a Black woman, when I show up in spaces, yes, I can be marginalized and other, but also as a lighter skinned Black woman, I have privilege. So I'm constantly grappling with, you know, the duality of privilege, bias, being marginalized, being oppressed, all of the things that is happening. So I know folks that are watching, you know, some folks, it may be, this is new. Even the language feels very nuanced or jargony. So if you can share a bit about, like, how did you even come to the awareness of race and racism? And let's just begin there.
Yeah, I can start, Camila.
Thank you, Jerry.
As a young person who grew up in a very segregated community, and my community in Chicago on the South Side was all Black people. I really didn't see people of another race unless I was watching TV or maybe a police officer or one of my teachers. So my experience was that of not learning other cultures. And not only that, being warned that if we go into another neighborhood that we can be harmed, particularly in some of the ethnic neighborhoods that are on the South Side, like Bridgeport, which was an Irish neighborhood, or Pilsen, which was a Mexican neighborhood. And so we grew up with these prejudices, right? These unfounded beliefs about people that weren't necessarily true, but they had some founding in what folks thought would keep people safe. And so that's a really important distinction to make when I get older and I start to experience different people in different cultures, going to high school and going to college. And, you know, reading and, you know, building relationships with people became essential. And I still believe to this day that relationships are probably the most essential anti-racist tool that we have, because we learn that we are obviously more similar and have more in common than we do difference. I would love to not talk about race or racism. I would love to talk about some food or some coffee or something. You know what I mean? But until this, this deficit and the scourge that we have that keeps us apart is here, I feel compelled. And not only is it here, but from learning and reading, particularly about the place in which we live, I've learned that race and racism is in everything. It is literally in where we choose to live and where we choose to send our kids and where we work, in the neighborhoods we live, the zip code. It is in, the water. If your trash get picked up on time, like, it is everything. And that was a hard learning experience for me as an educator. I'm an early childhood educator, so I'm naturally very optimistic, and I was very naive at first, saying that, some things are about race, some things are about class, some things are about gender, until I read, until I learned and listened to the experiences of some of the community members in every community in Dallas, and heard stories from people who we have erased and marginalized. For an example, we have a large American Indian community here in Dallas. This is one of the largest, I want to say fourth or fifth largest urban Indian communities in the country. There is little to no markers of their existence in this city. Not only that, we have a cabin, John Neely Bryan's cabin, that is near the Dallas Holocaust Museum, that they see as an affront to their existence, because he's known as the founder of Dallas, when not just their stories, but scientific research has shown that people have lived here for 12,000 years. Dallas is not even 200 years old yet. So I think that, realizing and digging into things like the city archives, which is a resource, right? And the archive floor, the 7th floor in the library, can help us start to dig and figure out some of these mysteries about how we got here and what we need to do.
Now, before you move on, I always notice you're very well read, Jerry, and you have quite the collection. So are there some books specifically, or videos, articles, anything that folks that want something quick and tangible? I know you mentioned the archives.
Yeah.
Other things.
Very tangible things. We can go to dallastrht.org /resources. We have YouTube videos, and we have a YouTube channel, and you can look at Dallas history videos that we've compiled from YouTube, right? That's a really tangible, easy thing to do. We also have some, reports that we've created that has really just an overview of some of the historic things that have happened because of race. So that's like really quick and tangible. If you want to dig into more of our history, we always say we start off with the accommodation. And I'm glad to be on the board of Deep Vellum Books. Deep Vellum Books is actually acquired the rights to publish the accommodation. And so we'll be publishing this book that has been out of print for a long time, almost 30 plus years next year. So I'm really excited about that. And the last thing before I pass to my colleagues is Michael Phillips' White Metropolis. It's a very academic book, but it is very well researched, and it also includes not only just race, but religion and other aspects of Dallas and its people.
Thank you. Those are both foundational reads for most of us. And you saw, we were very excited to hear about the publishing, because as most of us are aware, that's something that people are always ask for. It's like, well, how do I get a copy? How do I, is there something, how do I read that? And it's very foundational in understanding the context, the history here in Dallas. Jonathan, you want to jump in?
Well, I mean, again, Jerry's story and where he left off just felt like a natural place to jump in to me because, again, going back to education, a lot of my path, look, so I grew up again, as one of the, few kind of Jewish kids. I knew I was Jewish. My mom would come in and do Hanukkah because no one else in the school would celebrate. There's a difference between knowing difference and knowing race, though, right? Like, I don't think I had any conceptualization around whiteness at that time. I think that was part of what created this like mystery, right? In some ways for me, in terms of like, what am I? Am I this? Am I that? Where do I fit? And so I think that, and I also think about my elementary school education. I think about, Black educators who I had who exposed me to histories that I probably wouldn't have known about otherwise, right? Like, I remember learning about, the Amistad and Sojourner Truth, in second, third grade, very formative years. And I think that sparked something in me to kind of ask, what was missing from my own educational experience, right? Because so much of this history, I think about what Jerry just shared, and you kind of sit there and you have to ask, and I hope folks on the call wonder this too, especially if they have school-age children, what are my kids learning when they're going to school about not just history, but what are the texts in front of them look like? Are they seeing themselves? Are they seeing the windows and mirrors, right, into their own selves, identities, and maybe folks who don't share that same identity? And so that captivated me at a very, at this really formative stage, and really led me into this whole world of history, right? That I think Jerry is carrying that torch that, so many folks have been carrying for generations and generations, to push that into formal learning settings. That these are almost things you have to find out on your own, because they are kept away from, and I think systemically so, our formal education system. So I remember being a high school student who, again, was on this accelerated path, taking AP classes. My senior year, I lived in Chapel Hill right at the time. And I had to seek it out, one, but there's a university down the street, right? I wanted to take a Black history class. There's no Black history class at Chapel Hill High School, but I did have access and the know-how and the support to go take that class, right, off campus as a high school student. And I think about the fact that there were none of my peers, first of all, who had that opportunity. And second of all, there were none of my Black peers who had that opportunity either, and specifically. And so, that was my entry point to kind of unlearn and have this desire to understand a more accurate truth about the place and the country that I lived in. And that led me to want to understand my own family story in a much deeper way, and to understand the ways in which, a lot of ways, whiteness was formed in America for Jews through, a lot of benefit and a lot of privilege. And we could talk about that maybe in some other points in the conversation, right? But it led me to kind of untangle. So what was my family's history? Maybe we weren't always raised as white in America. How did that come to be? How were we systemically advantaged in many ways? So anyways, I'll stop there, but I wanted to pick up on that from what Jerry was saying.
And I want to also name like two of the points. One being like the erasure of marginalized people, people of color, Black folks, Indigenous people, Latinx people. Like, there is a history. And the reason why we have to kind of say, oh, I had to take a Black history class, or I have a Hispanic Heritage Month, is because that's not a part of the common and shared narrative. The reason why we need to seek out additional resources, because again, that is not the common narrative. And so part of our work in moving this forward, in dismantling racism, is how are we surfacing those untold stories, those uncommon voices? How are we lifting that up? And then also, how can we shift the curriculum? What is being taught? How can we make things accessible, right? There are systemic inequities that are existing that continue to perpetuate this. And so I just wanted to take that pause to name some of the ways in which we are seeing, and in the examples that you are given, that is systemic racism that's happening. Liz, I saw your mute was on. Do you have something to add to that particular point?
Oh, I'm enjoying hearing the conversation, but I just wanted to say that, just you sparked something in my history of like being one class away from getting my minor in Black Studies at Penn, and how happy I was. I was almost there, but didn't quite make but having incredible at the point being Black scholars where I went to study, not knowing what I was really walking into, but just being immersed in a pedagogy that was so new, where W.B. Du Bois actually lived, studied, and taught, was such an eye-opening experience for me as a young Latina in my undergraduate years, that I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we do have these opportunities, that we do have Black studies, that we do have, when I left Penn, a minor in Latin American studies. And that was sort of where I wanted to jump into it. Again, going back to the earlier point about our erasure of our indigenous roots. Growing up in East Dallas, I would have never known, right? Where my Aslan was, my homeland, if you will. But as I said, being a 70s kid, that is, if you look it up, the year of La Raza, the year of La Raza Unida, the year that the Latino, the Chicano movement actually came into being as a structural power to be proud, to be loud, to be political, and to be involved. And so people who were in that movement, when they hear when I was born, it's like, oh, you're born in the La Raza Unida. And I was like, I always kind of like felt gratified, but really not understanding what it was until I went to college and was able to see how fortunate I was. And then becoming sort of involved in advocacy work, realizing that there were so few of us who made it that far. I was immersed in a majority minority high school, so didn't really realize how lucky I was at that point to be immersed and proud and comfortable, until I went to a space where there were so few of us, and I was not immersed, not comfortable, and very marginalized, how I felt, at least. And so that's when I decided I need to learn about where I came from, and worked with some other Latino Chicano advocates to create a minor in Latin American studies. And to do this, we had to go to Latin America. And so they said, you were fighting and yelling about this program, so now you have to go. And so I went and studied in Oaxaca, Mexico. And it was just an eye-opening experience. And I hope my children decide they want to go to Oaxaca, Mexico, because I never would have gone to Oaxaca, Mexico had it not been for this fighting the power at my university, and realizing that how many languages that were spoken, indigenous languages in that one tiny state, how many cultures, how many subcultures, how many artisans and foods. To Jerry's point earlier about food and culture, just opened my eyes and realized that I had an indigenous past, and that it was there waiting for me to discover, if you will. And read the books that my minor had to offer, which is like The Conquest of America and The Discovery of the Other, and realizing that big part of me was my indigenous heritage, and that it still was with me, and what I feel is my spirit and my soul, and really led to a lot of advocacy work. When I came back, I wanted to study law, and I eventually became an immigration lawyer, and have had the real privilege to represent people from all over the world.
Thank you. In hearing you speak, I feel like a common thread of, because just as similar to you, I kind of gravitated towards, in college, African diaspora, and understanding like the studies of that, and understanding like the injustices that kind of flow, as well as what can be celebrated. And so that then kind of took my mind into a space of, how does this work differ? How does this work differ for specifically when we're talking about race? Because quite often, for many, many years, I would be doing this work, and the majority of the folks that were doing it were facilitating the work, that were educating everybody, that were holding space, that was healing others. were people that were already marginalized. And I think part of that speaks to the fact that, well, I have a lens over areas in which I have been oppressed, of areas in which I am biased, of areas of which I'm constantly grappling with because it impacts me daily, right? And so I am passionate from there. But then I feel very strongly, just from my Dallas community of collaborators, that like this thing is not just for those in a position of being marginalized. It's also, what does allyship look like? What does an advocate look like? What does, so, and what does that work? And how does that work differ? So as I enter into space, particularly mixed spaces, I'm often very aware of, these folks actually, the work might not be to agitate that. The work might be to heal. And then these folks, the work might not be just to give space for other people to lift up their voice. It may actually be to engage and to change and shift their own behaviors. And so can you all talk about like how your work or how you are seeing this work being different for as you entered into it, or as even allies in the movement?
Yeah, I could kick it off again. So I feel very different about the word ally.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that ending racism is everybody's work. Racism affects all of us. It makes where you live cost more. It makes your taxes higher. Like it affects you in those very material ways, but it also affects you in a very internal way, right? It makes you fearful about other people. It gives you anxiety. It makes you feel sometimes like you are better than people when, you are missing out on one of the best, relationships you could have. It also makes you feel inferior of people, and that you feel like you don't belong, or you are excluded. So racism is everybody's work to end. And when we talk about the word race and racism, we have to remember that race comes from racism. And racism comes from white supremacy and this concept of anti-Blackness. And that's some jargon, but there's a hierarchy of human value, right? And if we just make it really simple, folks always ask the question to me is why the conversation is always about Black and white, right? And there's a reason for that, right? That's because we have a hierarchical structure of racism where whiteness is on the top and Blackness is on the bottom. And everybody is forced to play a game of politics to move up and down the spectrum. And nobody, including Black people who are on the bottom, wants to be on the bottom of that spectrum, right? And so it's a constant fight to the top of that spectrum. And it is a political fight. And it's really important that folks understand why that conversation is binary and how we have to disrupt all of it, right? It is totally made up. Race is not biological. It is not any of that, right? So in order for us to do what you asked, right, this different ways of attacking this issue, TRHT, for instance, Dallas TRHT has a framework. The framework starts with narrative change or the truth. And I think that is kind of the best way in which people can enter the work, because I don't think you can start or enter a relationship even with yourselves without the truth, right? How are you, some people lie to themselves about what's happening, right? But definitely we can't lie to each other, right? We have to be honest about what's happening, or there's going to be some confrontation, right? But imagine if we can engage each other and tell the truth. I think we enter a very honest and open relationship. And after that, we enter into what we call racial healing or relationship building, right? If we're dealing with the truth, now we can build on something that's lasting, and we can support each other and be there for each other. And I think the last phase is equitable policies or practices or transformation, right? I think standing on a foundation of truth and building on that relationship, you all can now work together to change what is there, the status quo, and also move to something that is transformative and for everybody, right? That everybody can also benefit from. And the other last part that we don't talk about in the transformation phase is the healing that has to come by fixing the harm that we caused. Racism is happening right now, so there's harm being done to people. And so if we don't fix that harm, and we all believe in reparations, right? We all believe if Camila, you stole my watch, I would want it back, right? And if I didn't get it back from you, I would try to find another way, sue you or something to get it back. That's reparations, right? That is the concept. And so I think it's really important that we try to work very hard to fix, on a local level, fix the harms that we've caused as a city, as a people, and really address those so we can move to this place of real healing and real togetherness. And, you know, as Liz talks in her work in the city, belonging to a city, you know.
I think, thank you for that, Jerry. I think you touched on something specifically. It's kind of like, how are we all co-conspirators in disrupting this thing? And so I want to ensure that we are being intentional with what we are sharing with folks. So to be pointed, like there's instances where if I'm, you know, I've been in situations where I feel like I'm not necessarily threatened, but there's a whole conversation that feels very derogatory to me. And I'm in a position of, do I engage that? How do I protect this kind of fight, flight, freeze? What's happening in this moment? And that happens here in Dallas. And I think sometimes people don't realize the harm that is happening. So one question that I want us to talk about or name is like intervention. What does that look like? What are ways in which people can intervene? I also want us to talk a bit about, there's quite a bit of conversation and continues to be around, does white fragility exist? If so, how do we address that? How do we unlearn racism? What's a starting point to do that? What specific actions people can take? And then additionally, we all talked a lot about our childhood and education and how that kind of set us on a trajectory of understanding race. What can be done in that education space? I know there's parents that are watching, there are teachers that are watching, there are administrators. What are things that they can do?
So I'll jump in and just say, first of all, I wanted, first of all, put out the idea that the learning does not, and I'm speaking specifically for myself and to, you know, white folks who might be listening in, which is, you know, there's always an eagerness to say, so like, where's the action? What do we do? And trust me, like I spend most of my time thinking about that and working on that. But I do think it's important to say that the learning doesn't stop. And, you know, I can look back at my own life trajectory and say, like, there are pieces and times in my life where I didn't continue to do that self-work, that reflection, that learning. And it severely impacted the way in which I showed up to do what I would consider to be, quote unquote, the work outside of myself and with others. So I think that educational journey, I would encourage, you know, my white brothers and sisters out there to think about the fact that there's not going to be a done. There's not going to be an end point. And that can be and that's not just the book learning. That's like the learning that you're going through on an everyday basis in terms of exploring, you know, your own interactions, your own contributions to these systems, the ways in which you're benefiting or not, and resisting those things. So I just wanted to name that. You asked about, I think, you know, what are specific kinds of resources. I think I'm actually looking at Q&A because I'm fascinated by what folks are saying. I think there are people who are engaging in some of that learning already. So if the question, I would learn about a new resource today. It's called, I can look it up right now. It's called reconstruction.us. This is a website where curriculum creators are actually kind of, and especially in this moment, right? I want, you know, think about the fact that, you know, now education is actually happening for a lot of folks in the home. we have parents now who are looking over the shoulders of their children saying, well, what are you looking at? What are you learning? And I think one of the beautiful moments about this is there's now more curricular resources that are coming out there that educators of color and folks who are creating curriculum are putting these things forward. And this is just, again, reconstruction.us is probably just one example where, these tools and these learning opportunities are becoming democratized. So, and I saw another question about, well, what's actually happening in our own schools? And I know Jerry's been very involved with this as well as others on the panel. I mean, I want to say, what is it, Jerry, that this is the first year where, or maybe the second year where our school system's even offering an African-American studies history course, and expanding access to that is so important. So I know that those are just a couple of examples, but I'm curious what others have to say too.
And speaking directly to what you said, Camila, about like parents and teachers. So speaking just like as a person, I was also an educator. My first job was as a middle school teacher in rural Mississippi. And I was never, in the course of my teacher training, asked to think about race and racism, even though I was stepping foot as a white teacher in front of all Black students in rural Mississippi, right, in the school closest to where Emmett Till had been killed, teaching students that were the same age that he was when he was killed in that space, in that area. And so when I think about like, what are the interventions, or like, what are the things we need to do? And is white fragility at play? Well, yes. I work with groups of white people all the time, as well as individuals. And I can tell you that both from those observations and also just my own personal experience, like we all white people have some level of white fragility that we have to work on. Now, what does that mean? What's an example? So an example would be, a few years ago, I guess probably 5 or 6 years ago, even though I thought I had an awareness of racial justice, I was working with an organization called Leadership for Educational Equity. And one of their trainers had the group, who was the multiracial group, split up into a white affinity space and a affinity space for the folks of color. And so I was, for the very first time in my life, put into a space of all white people and asked to think about and talk about white identity. And I found it appalling at first. I shut down. I wondered why we had been segregated. I was not at first capable of really looking at myself as a white person and accepting that with whiteness comes a whole history that people who look like me have perpetuated and are continuing to do so, and that I myself might be doing the same. And that was coming from somebody, again, who had multiple like sessions and trainings on these topics. And so, or even something as recent as I went to a museum in Arizona within the past few years where they had documented the history of Native Americans in our country. And I realized in that experience, so it was really, this particular exhibit was a focus on Native American boarding schools. And I realized and had to confront the fact that I was not made aware as an educator in this country of the history of education in our country. I didn't understand the ways in which Native Americans had had their language and traditions made illegal, the ways that they had had their children forcibly removed from them and had forcibly been removed from their lands in order to create the country that we now have. And in that moment, in that museum, I stepped into one of the rooms in the exhibit, and it was one of the classrooms from the Native American boarding school that had been sort of blown up to real life through pictures and images. And it clicked for me that that was my classroom. It looked like my classroom. The ways that it was set up, the way the values and the character traits that were, posted on the walls, that these things that for me feel really benign, and the cultural realities that I carry that seem to me to be really valorous, were actually the result of a history of white supremacy, right? And that I had a lot of work within myself to understand the institutions and the personal actions I had been taking all the way up until that moment, that were continuing that legacy. And so when I think about like, what does intervention look like for us? Like, it's like to Jonathan and Jerry's points, it is deep re-education, recognizing the history that we were offered in school probably wasn't accurate or certain, and was very Eurocentric and whitewashed. But also, and so if you're a parent, that means really being very cognizant of how anti-Blackness is showing up all the time. There's research that's been done of young children that shows that even as parents may hold an anti-racist point of view, that young children in their early stages of development still often internalize messages of anti-Blackness and of physical differences translating to some type of difference in value, or that difference in you know, how nice or mean or smart or dumb or kind someone might be. And I see that even within my own 3-year-old. You know, we were at the park last week and she's usually very friendly, and there was a little Black boy who showed up and she did not engage with him. And so in that moment, I could have said nothing. But instead, as a parent who attempts to be consciously and actively anti-racist, I went up to her and started to ask her questions and started to unpack why was she reacting in this way? And, you know, she said, he's different. He may not be nice to me. Well, what does different mean? You know, what does his skin color really mean? Really, it means he has more melanin than us. And that's beautiful. His skin is beautiful, but white people and darker skinned people can be nice, can be mean. We don't know. We need to get to know these people. We need to get to know people who may not look like us. And so those are just like tiny ways, but also if you're a leader of an institution or if you're a leader of a classroom, there are institutional practices that you have to take on the commitment of creating. And I would recommend really working with someone like Jerry, a consultant, or someone like me. There are many people, and Camila, people in our community who provide consulting and resources specifically for the group of people that you most often operate within, whether that's parents, whether that's just white community members, whether that's a particular sector of, you know, nonprofit work, whatever it is, find the people and the resources that are going to help you move forward so that you aren't just relying upon your own biases and your own checks. That's, for me, I've had to learn that to move from that space of fragility to a space of really like action and feeling meaningful. The key for me was accountability to people of color. So who are the people that coach me, that guide me, that provide me feedback? Because I mess up all the time. My white conditioning comes back and comes through on a daily basis. And so I need the loving support of accountability partners who recognize that I seek to be anti-racist, but that it's really beyond my understanding as a white person to do that alone, and that it takes a lot of ongoing internal work, as well as changing the practices and institutions around me that I influence every day.
I think there's things, thank you for that first. And also I think there's 2 things you're tapping on into, is that there's our individual work, which is about that, what have we internalized, as well as how are we interacting with folks at an interpersonal level. And then there's that charge of like institutional, structural, how are we changing policies? How are we understanding what can be done through our systems that are at play, whether that's government, health, education, economy. There's so many ways in which racism is being manifested. One of the things that I also heard from both Julia and Jonathan is like, this work is continual. This isn't something that is one and done. You read this book and it's 5 ways to end racism and now you are completely anti-racist and go. No, it's continual work, because we are continuing to surface ways in which we've internalized it, ways in which we're complicit, and ways in which we can show up for other people in this and for ourselves. I think it's critically important to acknowledge that you all are offering some really insightful resources and references. So if you could send those kind of to the team later, and maybe we can compile a list to send out to folks watching, because that is one of the questions I have been seeing in the QA is, you know, can you say that again? Or don't worry, we will make sure that we share some of the resources that we have discussed. One of the questions I also noticed was specifically for you, Liz, and it was regarding the city of Dallas and what areas of anti-racism work is happening with the city. So if you want to talk on that, I mean, your office is doing so many different things. So if you could share with them what's happening at the city level.
Well, thank you for that question. And I'm always happy to talk about what we're doing at the City of Dallas, and toot the horn of my team. We're all working hard together, and I'm really proud of the work that they're doing. And I just sort of go along with this ride because it's an endeavor that started when structurally and systemically, at least, when our city manager arrived in the city of Dallas and submitted for review and consideration a new set of values that included equity. And so it was equity, ethics, excellence, and empathy. And so it's all very, to me as a new employee, it's like, what does this mean by empathy and equity? I've heard about ethics and I've heard about excellence, but this is sort of new to me. And over time, I came to understand that it really is, on what they said, is about everybody. It's everybody's work. It's not an Office of Equity's work or an Office of Equity Inclusion's work. It's about everybody having this value system of what our core values are. And this is what we're going to advance as a city staff of over 13,000 or close to 13,000 individuals. And so how do we do it? Well, we have to create the structures within the organizational chart. And Jack was a big part of that. He was a part of a community partnership where my predecessor, Teresa O'Donnell, who was a resilience officer at the city, met to create a resilience strategy. And out of that resilience strategy, number one goal to submit to, so of course, to council, number one goal was advancing equity in city government. And in those goals was strategies and recommendations, and was to create an equity. And so out of all of these steps, right, take step by step by step by step, we have now developed this Office of Equity and Inclusion, which integrates several different offices, as I said previously. And so each of these divisions in this Office of Equity and Inclusion works directly to address the inequalities throughout their specific line of work, looking at it with a particular lens in our equity division, which strives to help shape a city government where everyone thrives. And the department does this by focusing internally, analyzing policies, practices, and programs alongside our city department for consideration by our city council. And we have heard even by somebody on the panel here, it's like, well, you need to do more work on the outside. You need to do more community engagement. And in fact, we do, and we do believe that's a core part of our tool, right, is to engage our community and not like after we've baked the cake, but right during it, to get their feedback and their viewpoints and understandings of where we're heading. And so we can give her of examples, but as one example is we started a budgeting for equity tool two budget cycles ago. So we're into our third year this coming year. And it really is a process where this Office of Equity and Inclusion is working alongside our Office of Budget to meet every department to help understand, to have them understand what the ethos is, get their feedback, and to give them feedback about how do you apply a racial equity lens on your budget, not just for enhancements, but as you're using what exists currently. And so that has been, it's not something that's visible necessarily when you go out and say, what the city has done, but it's something that we have internalized and are working through so that when the budget is finalized for submission and consideration, you can see that, that equity isn't alive and is included as part of what we're submitting. And for instance, if you look up what was passed in this budget, you'll see real action items, real change items. Now, is it enough? you know, some would argue it's not nearly enough, but it's where we are starting structurally to make these substantial changes. We're also working in the area of right now during COVID-19 is to how to understand how COVID-19 is impacting all community, but those who are being disproportionately impacted, we know are communities of color who oftentimes are on the essential services lines that do live sometimes, many times in multi-generational families. And even if they do have COVID, don't necessarily have a place to quarantine, et cetera. So part of our work is also looking, how do we apply an equity assessment tool so that in the delivery of resources that we have right now during COVID, we're looking to those who are most impacted, those most vulnerable communities, in terms of how do we align where the testing centers are, where do we apply a lens so that we're making sure that the resources that we have in terms of food security or even cash in hand or other resources are being applied with that racial equity lens.
I think it's really important, and thank you for that transparency, because that's also a model, right? Like in the work that I do just on a consulting basis, it's like there is evaluation that needs to take place within an organization to understand where you are at. There is that taking that equity lens, making it measurable. So there's an accountability. And then like strategically also listening to the communities that are most impacted by the decisions that are being made, right? And there's this kind of co-creation, co-design, collaborative nature to this work, to understanding people that are impacted often do know what they need. It's about, they're not necessarily in that position to be heard about those needs. So I applaud and appreciate like the community efforts to understand that there are, you know, Black and Brown communities that are disproportionately impacted by COVID. And also understanding that tying the financial city budget to the strategies to create equity is also critically important, because it speaks to investing in change and culpability. And I think that's something that many different organizations and industries can take that understanding as an approach to this work. So I thank you, appreciate that. I also want to note that there's a question being asked specifically around the ISD or even Texas schools around education and curriculum, because we talked about the institutional understanding that we need to elevate and shift so that there is a broader truth and a historical narrative that is representative of our actual history. So does anyone have any information about what can be done, what needs to be done to diversify our curriculum?
We have 3 educators on this panel, so I'm gonna be quiet.
Okay, Liz.
Well, go ahead, Jerry.
No, you know, I work very closely with 2 school districts, with Richardson ISD and Dallas ISD. Both of them now have offices of equity, which is amazing. I you know, for my folks who know me for a long time, those didn't exist 5 years ago. You know what I mean? So that's a good thing, right? The most important thing, and this is something that we really believe in Dallas TRHT, is that we are working to move institutions towards racial equity, because we believe that institutions make up the structure, which is what we call racism, right? If we can get an institution to break a chink in the armor of that structure, that means that it can all fall down. So we really think that we can help institutions move. And I think that the school districts are some of the largest institutions in our cities. So it's really important that we continue, as Liz talked about at her thing, continue to press and to push our institutions to do the work that they already are called to do. In education, very specifically, we know that TEA has had some issues with telling the truth when it comes to race and racism. There was an instance where a Black mom was informed by her son that enslaved Africans were called laborers and workers, and when were invited into this country to work, just telling lies to children, and it became a national story. You know, TEA had to recall that book, and recalling a book in Texas, one of the largest states in the country, is a huge task, right? So I think that we can, you know, make efforts and continue to push folks to do that. And Jonathan mentioned that African American course that started in DISD and now has trickled down to the state has been passed, and so that may happen statewide. Also, a Mexican American course, which is amazing too. It should have happened already. We live in Texas, you know what I mean? So that's that.
And that's what I wanted to say, Jerry. You know, and to kind of piggyback on what Liz was sharing is, you know, policy and politics matter. And, you know, to go back to what Jerry, I think, started, which is a very profound thing. And I know it's something that, you know, the work of Dr. Ibram Kendi kind of lifts up in a big way, is this idea that racism is what created and reinforces race. And racism is a power structure, right? Racism is a set of policies and systems, right? And so the institutions like the school district in the city that we're talking about, they are oftentimes, they are doing what is within what they view as being politically possible, right? And, you know, so to Jerry's question or point, I would say, how many listeners out there are involved and know who their elected school board member is? You know, there are 2 school board races going on right now in our city. There are 3, I guess there's supposed to be 3 every year. These are really critical positions that have a lot of influence on the conversations that we're having right now. The State Board of Education is the body that decides the curricular standards for the state. How many of us actually know who our elected school board, state school board member is? And I would wager the answer is low, and I can tell you that because if I were to look at the election returns on these things, we got less than 10% of people in off-year elections usually voting for these folks. And so these are really, really important things. We're in the middle of an election, so I know people are anxious about what do I do? How do I get involved? This is something you're probably, I pray, going to do anyways, but be an informed voter and then have a relationship with, as a constituent, your elected officials so that you can ask them these questions and put the question to them. And then, of course, not just take what they say, but really follow what they do and be involved in not just as an individual. I know that can be intimidating, but groups that do that work. And so, you know, that's part of the organization I'm with, you know, with Ed Trust in Texas is trying to build that space for a vast number of folks to be a part of education equity across the state, to create the political and political will, you know, and the public will that it takes to move these conversations. I don't have to tell you or probably anyone on this call that textbook uniquely exists in Texas for a lot of reasons, and it's because of the politics of our state. And so I think we have to be thinking about that policy lever as well.
And just to, you know, just the last point of that I really wanted to state was that there's also been a lot of involvement in our community in ending some white supremacy and racism. We have to give our community credit. 4 school names have been changed in the last 2 years. They were names of people who served in the Confederacy, a war that was meant to uphold slavery, and folks who believed in white supremacy and segregation. So I really applaud our community for taking some of those steps, and we need to continue on those steps. You know, right now there's a push to memorialize victims of racial violence right near the museum, and it's led by Dr. George Keaton, who I know is on this call right now. But there's some other things that are happening, and I think joining these organizations like Dallas Mexican American Historical League and Remembering Black Dallas and Jewish Historical League are ways in which you can do that really quickly and support folks who are already doing the work.
Shout out to Dr. Keaton for being a part of our community engagement at the City of Dallas. Just a a wealth of information and resource about our history, about our culture, and recently was our keynote speaker on a virtual exhibit that we're taking around town vis-a-vis the internet called Undesign the Red Line. And Jerry is also a part of the Community Advisory Board. And it went up in City Hall last year. Chairman Casey Thomas, who chairs our Workforce Education and Equity Committee, saw it in another city and said, this is something that the city of Dallas should be involved in. It's really telling the story, the historical story of redlining and how redlining came to be as a federal government program and how it has impacted communities, large cities, smaller cities around our nation that today, to this day, we live with the vestiges of. And so as we're talking about the point of education, we living in a digital environment where our children are 100% right, engaging and learning vis-a-vis distance learning. And for us not to be thinking about the inequities there, it would be I think, sinful. And I know that we are. And so the school districts, I know because I sit on the Internet for All Coalition, have been very engaged in rolling up their sleeves, trying to figure out how do they deploy hardware devices to their student population so that they can not fall behind. But we still know that the ecosystem pre-COVID is something that doesn't make that very easy, because we live in a world of a digital divide, as well as, I believe, related to the redlining vestige, which created a disinvestment in many of our communities. And part of that disinvestment was the broadband infrastructure, I believe, that currently exists to this day. So the city, with its through its ad hoc committee that was formed by Mayor Johnson and continues to convene as relates to the economic recovery and social services, met today. And we're talking about these deployments of interventions so that we can build the infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, the Wi-Fi infrastructure that needs to be built up in our communities where we know have the highest disparities in terms of the digital divide. So that's one way we see equity showing up in city policy and practices that are connected with the work that we do in terms of community engagement with our Undesign the Redlining virtual exhibit.
And is that something that people can recognize?
Yes, we have two more. We have two more engagements on Thursday, October 22nd from 6 to 7:30, and Thursday, November 12th from 11:30 to 1 p.m. And if you want more information, you can follow us at @EquityDallas on Twitter, and we'll be pleased to give you more information about how you can register to be a part of it, of the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. There are several questions I'm seeing. I know that I'm trying to also pay attention and be mindful of the time. I think that, again, you've been very insightful with your resource sharing, and so we are going to compile a document to again, be useful to our viewers and those watching tonight. Before we close, there's a question around healing and creating spaces, specifically like affinity spaces, or it could be whether that's, I think there's one specific question relating to a white space and healing. And then also, I know that there's just various healing spaces that people are looking for. And also, are there resources for self-reflection? They're not quite ready to dive into doing something that's a group activity. Is there resources you would recommend for self-reflection? See you shaking your head, Juliana. Something you want to share?
Yeah, I think that's a really critical piece, especially for white folks, is that internal self-reflection and learning. So one of the frameworks that I train on is by Dr. Barbara Love. She is one of my foundational teachers, and she talks about the journey for a white person and really being deeply ingrained in racial justice work. Starts with awareness, analysis, action, and then accountability. And so awareness, right, and analysis are the first two pieces of that. Even prior to action, a lot of times we as white folks, we're really gung-ho, we want to make a difference, we jump into action without really deeply assessing for ourselves the roles that are appropriate for us to play within a system of racism, or how we might show up. And that's an ongoing journey. But definitely I would encourage you to work with a partner. So I have a consulting website, just Julianna Bradley consulting.com, and it has a list of a lot of resources that white folks can take and do a reading a week, calendar it into your personal development plan. Because one of the things that is very true about the impact of racism on white folks is that to some degree it has infantilized us. There are a number of things that we've never been asked to reflect on or really think about or learn. And so oftentimes when we want to engage in real critical conversations about race, we shut down, or we just don't feel like we have the vocabulary or the awareness to have a productive conversation. And oftentimes because of our privilege and our white privilege, we have the power to shut conversations down, or to actually just prevent progress from occurring. And so I do want to just second that is a big piece, and that for folks who want to create a wide affinity space, there are lots of great groups. So locally, they're showing up for racial justice. There's a place that you can go and do some learning. You can work with a consultant like myself, which I think is critical if you really, especially if you're in any type of leadership position or working within an institution. There's also a website online called the whiteallytoolkit.com. I really encourage folks who are interested in engaging with other white people to use that resource. It was written by Dr. David Campt. He's a Black man who coaches white people who want to become anti-racist on an active daily basis. It's one of the resources I rely on most heavily just on a day-to-day basis. And then there's also a website called whiteawake.org, where they've got all kinds of resources. They have a long, beautiful list of readings that you can do individually. And then they also host virtual courses. So they have a white people course coming up that's called Reconnect to Our Spirit and Our Humanity to Interrupt White Supremacy. And so it's also not only about the sort of intellectual academic learning, but really the spiritual and emotional work that we need to do within ourselves to be able to really move in a direction that is more anti-racist, and all that comes with, a lot of times it can be challenging to learn and think about these things. I know that, in my journey, I've gone through bouts of depression and anxiety and just grappling with what does it mean to be a white person who both benefits from, but also wants to challenge racism. And it's an ongoing journey. So seek out friends, supporters, seek out myself, seek out other resources, because there are many out there. And I definitely encourage you to visit my website and reach out to me if I can be of any help.
Thank you. I'll give each person time, like a minute, just to share last final thoughts or resources.
So Dallas TRHT next week, October 21st, is having a new community vision for Dallas. It is our annual celebration, number one, of our Racial Equity Now cohort, our first graduating cohort of 16 organizations who have went through a process of learning about race and creating racial equity tools for their organizations to do this work. It's also a release of our 2020 report. Last year, we focused on the Indigenous American Indian community and the Black community in Dallas. This year, we're focusing on the Latinx community and the Jewish community. So I'm really excited to release some of that information and talk about heroes like Pancho Medrano and Adolfo Caello and Anita Martinez and a lot of other people that have been kind of erased from our history and need to be celebrated. And on October 24th, Young Leaders Strong City is having its free racial justice teen equity summit for high school students. If you go to ylscmovement.com, and folks always say, I need some resources for my kids. This is a free resource. Every kid is gonna get a gift card If they sign up, they're going to learn about identity and race, and they're going to be with their peers, and they're going to learn how to change things in their community. So those are 2 resources coming up October 21st and October 24th.
And repeat those websites.
DallasTRHT.org and YLSCmovement.com.
Thank you. And for those asking, that was Julianna Bradley Consulting. That was her website. Thank you, Jerry. Thanks, Julianna. Liz, you next.
I'm happy to go next. And thank you, Jerry, for all that you're doing. And I'm looking forward to next week's celebration. And just as a personal note, Adelpha Callejo is my personal mentor. And so if you need any history tidbits, just give me a buzz and I'll be happy to share them with you.
Yep, I knew that too.
And with Adelpha, now that you mentioned her name, God rest her soul, what she used to say is, that if you don't speak up against injustice, not even God will hear you. So I look at a lot of the work that we do in my office as a matter of justice, and look at how do we figure out how do we all be more just one another together, and have a city that we can be more belonging to and more welcoming, and just proud to be Dallasites when we're out in the world and people ask about us, because we know that we have a lot of assets. We've made a lot of inroads in certain areas, but we still have a long ways to go. So I want to end there, but just say that wearing my dissent necklace, because I also wanted to hearken to RBG, who said that, you do things that matter, but do them in a way that make other people, to paraphrase her, want to move along with you. And so all of these people right here, I would really want to move along with them in their work, because really are inspiring and have inspired me this evening. And it's been sort of cathartic and healing. So I want to thank all of you and Mary Pat and the team, Annie, Spencer, for inviting me to come along.
Thanks, Liz. Jonathan?
Wow, I mean, such great resources from everyone on the group. I would say, again, to any white Jewish listeners out there, my mind was flipped last week. I watched a sermon that was given on Yom Kippur by a rabbi of Asian American descent, and it's called "We Are Family: Rethinking Race in the Jewish Community." It is 20 minutes that is well worth it. It challenged me in all of the best ways, and I would encourage folks who are interested to check that out. It's on YouTube. And then I'll just kind of make the plug, which is edtrust.org is the organization that I'm a part of, proud to be a part of. It's headed by the former Secretary of Education, John King, and we're doing national work, state work, trying to lock arms with local partners across the state and across the country who are addressing issues like the one that Liz raised earlier, just as one of many that right now I just think are really hitting our students of color, our low-income students and families across the country in a really hard way. And so I would just encourage folks to plug in. We've got a legislative session that's coming up right after these elections. And trust me, public education is going to be right there at the top of the list. And so, if we can be a resource to help folks get involved and use their voice as constituents, then we would love to help do that.
Thank you. And Jonathan, can you mention that video name one more time for folks?
Yeah, it's We Are Family: Rethinking Race in the Jewish Community. If you type in Yom Kippur Sermon Central Synagogue, it'll probably come up.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of my panelists that joined tonight. I appreciate you. I send lots of love and gratitude. It is just so critically important that when we're doing this work, we can have folks that we can lift up and know that even though we might not see each other, we might not know what's happening, we are in this together. I can't stress that enough. Again, my name is Camila Collins. I am president of Collins Collaborations. I focus on transformative change by bringing practices of honest communication and joy human joy into spaces. And tonight, the panel you see, they are working hard at what they do, which is creating change, that is equitable and that is inclusive. And quite frankly, that is just anti-racist. And they are good humans to know. And I just thank you for sharing so many resources. Again, for those of you that are wondering, like, I didn't write that down, I didn't quite capture it, we will make sure that the resources will be available to you following this. I know Spencer and Annie have been capturing some things, but as panelists, if you can just, we'll make sure we get some links out there to you. Again, I thank you for joining us. I thank you for your time. I appreciate all that you're doing. Have a good night, folks.
And we've actually got Mary Pat coming back to say her thanks as well before you all leave.
Yeah. Thank you. That's okay. Thank you, Camila. And I just wanted to, before we end tonight, to thank Julianna, Liz, Jonathan, Jerry, and Camila for spending your evening with us, for sharing how we can all take steps to disrupt systemic racism. And thank you all for being on this journey with us. These conversations can be difficult and uncomfortable, but having an open dialogue is an important step to creating meaningful change. As Camila said, we'll be following up with an email with resources that the panelists have recommended, so don't worry about that. We'll also send you a link to our toolkit for disrupting racism and links to online lessons. I hope that you'll stay engaged with the museum and join us for future programs about racism, as well as next year's Crucial Conversation series that will focus on anti-Semitism. Thank you and good night.